Right after we said that an AMD R3 CPU is enough for gaming, Intel decided to try and take back its old mantra from several generations ago. Well, generations, depending on how you define them. Intel's definition of a generation implies that now the 10th series of core processors is the 10th generation. We'll go with it, but in reality, this is the nth generation of a long-standing architecture. It's gotten more frequency bumps in some ways, and more importantly, Intel has continued to bring down higher core counts to lower prices. So its real advancements here are primarily in the price to core or price to performance range, rather than a pure architectural improvement, which will come at some point, but today is not the focal point for architecture. It's really going to be cores and frequency at a given price. The 10600K is the one we're reviewing in this video. We already reviewed the 10900K. That's up on the channel if you want in-depth discussion on that. Thermal power, everything else. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake's Tough RAM RGB memory, available from 3000 MHz up to 4400 MHz in 8 GB by 2 configurations. The Thermaltake Tough RAM uses 10 addressable RGB LEDs for bright illumination and comes in both black and white kits of memory. Learn more at the link in the description below. A quick recap on the 10600K then. First of all, Intel's naming is absolutely atrocious for this generation, and so we don't expect anyone to be able to keep up, because we can barely keep up. The number one biggest thing we need to define in both of these videos is that a 10900X is not the same as a 10900K. The X at the end of it is explicitly for HEDT parts. So when you're looking at the charts, even in this review of the 10600K, note that the 10900X, when you see it appear, is for an HEDT platform, and it's a CPU that we declared dead on arrival. So that's very different from the 10900K. As for the 10600K, well, there's only really one way to interpret that, because it's the only one. But the naming is still getting tough to follow. In either case, the expected price range for the 10600K that we're reviewing in this one should be somewhere about $260 to maybe $280. The prices listed by Intel at its official specifications pages and on ARC are for 1,000 units. So that's sort of a wholesale pricing, and this is the way Intel's always done it. We don't know exactly what retail pricing will be today at time of filming, which is about 9 hours before launch at this point. So we'll have to find out when you do what the pricing is. We're going to write this review based on the assumption that it's in a price range of about $260 to about $280, give or take maybe 10. And if it's above that, then the comparisons will change to more look at something like a 3700X, which we're talking about here as well. For the rest of this, we're not going to sit here and read the spec sheet for you. We'll put it up on the screen though. That's the specifications that Intel showed off during its announcement of all the new CPUs for the 10 series. We have a full video on that with a news recap, and if you want to learn more about those and learn more about the D-lid, the die sanding, all of that special stuff, you can watch the previous video. But for this one, we're going to be looking at the die sanding, which is only available for the K SKUs, talking about core-to-core deltas. This is critically important to overclocking headroom, because the hottest single core is going to limit all your cores for your all-core overclock, at least in an easy fashion. And so the die sanding, where Intel physically is removing height off of the die to improve thermals and thicken the IHS and improve thermal responsiveness, that's all going to come into play with the 10600K and the 10900K. Intel also, just to give a quick important note, listed its clock speed as 4.8 gigahertz for the CPU. We were disappointed, however, to later find out that this was a typographical error, and it's supposed to say clock. So we will not be overclocking this CPU, but we will be overclocking it in this review. There's no TVB listed on ARC. It's just 4.1 gigahertz base and 4.8 boost. We'll go through those numbers. Explicitly, this does not have TVB or thermal velocity boost. TVB is on the 10900K, 10700, and it's defined as a 70 degrees Celsius threshold, at which point below that you are 100 megahertz lower than above it. And then this CPU has 16 PCIe lanes from the CPU. Those are the core specs. The rest is on the spec sheet. Go read it if you want that. Let's get into the benchmarks. We'll start with the core-to-core deltas, what you should see on these CPUs, and go through all the gaming and production tests with a careful eye on the 3600 at now $180 US, and the 3700X at around the same price as this one. In our 10900K piece, we talked about how the Intel i9 10900K improved its core-to-core deltas massively, at least in our sample, versus some of Intel's previous endeavors. Our 10900K had a range of about 9 degrees Celsius max core-to-core at 317 watts, which is impressively tight together. That means more overclocking headroom before becoming bound on the single hottest core. And that was thanks to Intel's die sanding approach that they exclusively took with the K SKU CPUs for the 10 series. The 10600K is another one of those, and we'll plot that. Our previous chart from the 10900K review left off with these numbers, with the 9C delta for the OC result, or about 5 to 6 with stock at 130 watts, and the 9900K lower down. The 10600K at full stock settings runs an average of about 3 degrees max core-to-core delta, peak to peak, at a given interval. So it's similar to the 9900K stock, and is again, really damn good. Here's a look at what this CPU is supposed to do. This command line readout comes from a tool we acquired from a motherboard partner, and it's useful for verifying if your CPU is running at the actual Intel default guidance settings, rather than pre-overclocked settings. Intel's PL1 is defined as 125 watts for the CPU. The 10900K, for reference, calls for 125 watts as well, but it defines PL2 as 250 watts. Intel typically does 1.25 times PL1 for that number. PL2 for the 10600K is 182 watts, with tau set to 56 seconds. That's the maximum window that Turbo is allowed to execute at its higher power consumption before falling back to lower clocks and lower power. Cores 1, 2, and 3 are the best on our 10600K and run a 48x multiplier under stock settings, with the rest at 47, 45, and 45. That's how it's supposed to behave, and anything outside of this is outside of Intel's official spec. We define this in reviews these days because of previous games that motherboard makers have played where they'll enable MCE and blast the power without people really noticing it. For frequency, we log a pass of Cinebench R20 single-threaded test to verify that boosting behavior is normal, and any multi-core enhancement features are disabled. Base clock for the 10600K is 4.1 GHz, max boost is 4.8, and max all-core is 4.5, a relatively narrow range of operating frequencies. The 10 series CPUs that fall below the i9-10900 lack Intel's new temperature-dependent thermal velocity boost, and the ones that fall below the i7-10700 lack Turbo Boost 3.0. So 4.8 is the absolute maximum frequency that any core should hit in the i5 without an overclock. The logged frequency confirms this, with the processor maxing out at 4.8 GHz on 3 cores, while the others hold between 4.5 to 4.7 GHz. Intel lists max turbo as the maximum single core frequency on ARC, but we've confirmed that 4.8 GHz on 3 cores is expected behavior per our internal BIOS validation tool. The chart you've been looking at is super zoomed in intentionally, so we're looking at a range of 4400 to 4900 MHz and a time window of only 100 seconds. This helps illustrate what the cores are doing individually, although it's still hard to read. This chart is for all-core and Blender, starting with the 10900K as a baseline in blue. The 10600K all-core Blender load we designed for thermal testing and sustained loads locked frequencies down to a max of 4.5 GHz, but with frequent dips down to 4.4 GHz on individual cores. This confirms the processor is boosting as expected and is following Intel's spec. Moving into games, we'll start with Total War, Three Kingdoms, and the campaign benchmark at 1080p. Average FPS for the stock 10600K and the campaign benchmark was 138 FPS, which improved by 5.8% up to 146 with an overclock. A promising start for the overclocked results. 5.1 GHz isn't especially impressive as a number for Intel at this point, but with relatively low boost clocks of the 10600K in general, it's a significant step up from stock. Like most games, Total War Three Kingdoms has a steep drop-off in the performance scaling with higher thread counts past a point. So the 6-core, 6-thread 9600K that the 10600K replaced isn't hurt much by the lack of hyperthreading, with averages of 133 FPS stock and 144 FPS at 5.1 GHz all-core. Intel is at a point where its advantages in the i9 are difficult to realize, at least within reason, and so the 10600K begins to look better from a strict realism and value standpoint. AMD's 3700X is in the same price range as the 10600K should be, due to sales at the time of writing, but overhead on the AMD chips has them falling behind Intel's CPUs here. The 3700X averaged at 125 FPS stock, behind the 9600K. AMD's core and thread equivalent to the i5, the R5 3600, averaged at 122 FPS, even with a 4.3 GHz overclock. 1% and 0.1% lows on the stock 3700X and the 10600K are approximately the same, both comfortably above 60 FPS, but the overclocked 10600K increased its 1% to 101 from 93 for the average of them. The nature of 1% and 0.1% lows means that they're more variable than the overall average, so neither AMD nor Intel has a clear advantage in that category, and neither can be stated here as being, quote, smoother than the other. The Hitman 2 results are favorable for the 10600K. Stock average was 128 FPS, but the overclocked average was 135. tying the overclocked 9900K at the same frequency. Note that we actually have direct CPU scaling in this game, illustrated by the 10900K maxing out at 5.3 GHz and 149 FPS average. The overclocked 9900K regularly tops the charts, and a cheaper i5 with a lower core count, a lower boost clock, and a smaller cache coming close to it is an achievement. The 10600K's stock average is significantly higher than the non-hyperthreaded 9600K's average of 115 FPS, and even its average of 125 FPS when overclocked to 5.1 GHz. This is another title where the framerate cap seems to be a step lower on AMD's CPUs, so their price competitive 3700X averaged only 118 FPS, while the 4.3 GHz overclock on the R5 3600 achieved 115 FPS average. 1% and 0.1% lows are always lower in this benchmark than the others, but they still follow the same pattern as the overall FPS averages, with none of the CPUs we've mentioned experiencing any serious frame time issues. The 10600K ends up 9% ahead of the 3700X when both are stock, or 12% ahead of the 3600. The Civilization 6 Gathering Storm AI benchmark scores based on turn time rather than FPS, making it unique among our game benchmarks. Average turn time for the stock 10600K was 32.4 seconds, and the overclock brought that down by 6.8% to 30.2 seconds. The 10600K is 6% faster than the older 9600K here, which averaged 34.5 seconds stock and 31 seconds overclocked. Civilization 6 benchmark averages are extremely consistent, so fractions of a second are valid differences. The odd scenario of a non-hyperthreaded i7 followed by a hyperthreaded i5 in the next generation creates some results like this. AMD put up a much better stock versus stock showing here than the previous two games, with the 3700X against stock almost tying the 10600K stock, while the overclocked 3600 falls a bit behind. Max boost for the 3700X is 4.4 GHz, so even though the 4.3 all-core on the 3600 is pretty good, the 3700X can boost even higher in limited core scenarios and often outperform it in games. The F1 2019 benchmark has become one of our preferred benchmarks for CPU reviews. Although the frame rates are ridiculously high, it's because we still haven't encountered any hard non-CPU limits, which means that there's good non-bottleneck scaling all the way up to the top of the chart. Usefulness outside of empirical differences becomes more questionable here, but it does allow us to see an objective look at the stack. Stock FPS was 259 average, and the OC average was 3.1% higher at 267 FPS. Lows improved in lockstep with the OC. The 9600K is far behind, although the high numbers make it look even further than it is. The 10600K outperforms it by 17.4%, and even a 5.1 GHz overclock only brings the 9600K up to 244 FPS average. Going a price tier above the i5 to the stock i7-9700K leapfrogs the 10600K's result with an average of 269 FPS, practically tied with the overclocked 10600K. AMD's 3700X averaged a stable 239 FPS with a 1% low of 167 FPS, and neither of these numbers, though, is low enough to reflect any visible hitching or stuttering in the CPUs. Results for F1 at 1440p are at best the same as results at 1080p, and at worst limited to the same FPS average due to GPU bottlenecking, which is why we typically discuss our 1080p results far more. F1 is one of the less GPU bottlenecked games we test though, so there's still some limited scaling. The compressed scale has the 10600K only outperforming the 3700X by 1.5% here, which is a useful reminder that at higher resolutions, any half-decent CPU will achieve roughly the same level of performance as the others. You're GPU bound now, and that may diminish the importance of a CPU choice. Even with the adjustments we've made to our Division 2 benchmark, it's susceptible to GPU bottlenecking at the upper end of the chart where the 10600K happens to land. Scaling with an overclock is minimal, up to 203 FPS average from 202 stock. The real scaling begins at the 9600K and below. The older i5 scales up 9.4% with an overclock from 177 FPS average stock to almost the same limit as the 10600K at 194 FPS average overclocked. Our chart for this test will remain relatively limited until we finish retesting our inventory of CPUs, but the takeaway is that the 10600K can easily keep up with Intel's highest end offerings in this GPU limited title. If the 1080p Division 2 test has GPU limitations, the 1440p one will have a GPU brick wall. All the Intel i5s and i7s we've tested thus far averaged in a 149 to 152 FPS range, and they're all within error of each other. This at least confirms that the new 10 series parts don't pull that GPU limit any lower, and they still fall safely in the same bracket as the rest of Intel CPUs. The AMD R5 to R9 CPUs fall within their own bracket from 142 to 145. So it's a safe bet that this is where the 3700K would fall if we retested it for this review. Shadow of the Tomb Raider showed minimal response to the 10600K's 5.1 GHz overclock, with the overall average rising only slightly from stock, up from 163 FPS to 166 FPS. The 10600K fell behind the higher-priced 9700K's 172 FPS average in this test, but the 6-core, 6-thread 9600K averaged only 148 FPS stock. So the newer i5 is positioned appropriately between last gen's price equivalent and higher-end CPUs. AMD's 3700X averaged 149 FPS at the upper end of the range for Ryzen CPUs in this test, but well behind the 10600K. As one of our oldest game benchmarks, GTA 5 is also one of our most frequency-dependent rather than core-dependent benchmarks, in some scenarios anyway. So this isn't especially good news for the 10600K. Stock average was 114 FPS, up 6.9% to 122 when overclocked. The slightly higher boosting 9700K averaged 122 stock, but was also performing better when both CPUs were overclocked to 5.1. We did retest to verify this result, and it held up. We've seen GTA 5 ignore or even perform worse with SMT in the past. For instance, with the nearly identical 6-core, 6-thread 3500X and 6-core, 12-thread 3600 results, although we've stripped the 3500 from this one, and the fairly similar 8-core, 8-thread 9700K and 8-core, 16-thread 9900K results. With that in mind, it makes sense that the 8-core 16-thread 3700X doesn't derive any advantage from its higher core count and averages 109 FPS here. Time to move on to production benchmarks. Interestingly, there's finally an i5 that might actually be competitive in production applications like Blender. We'll start there, since it'll allow us to use a tile-based renderer to set the stage for thread scaling. With the GNMonkey head render, the Intel i5-10600K stock CPU completes the render in 18.8 minutes, which has it marginally ahead of the 6-core, 12-thread 8086K and just behind the AMD R5 3600, which has been under $200 lately. Overclocking the 10600K to 5 GHz puts it past both the 3600 results, landing at 17 minutes, and that's a reduction in time of 9.6% versus stock. That also puts it next to an R7 2700 at 4.1 GHz and an i7 9700K at 17 minutes for its scoring. Interestingly, again, this is where we see the usual 30% improvement from hyperthreading, as opposed to a more linear, pure core increase. The 9700K, despite having 4 fewer threads, is keeping pace with the 10600K at similar frequencies. The 10600K's 2 fewer physical cores account for that. The R5 3600 and i5 10600K are neck and neck here, and can be thought of as functionally equivalent thus far. The pricing favors the R5 3600, and the overclocking favors the i5 10600K. So there's a win for each one of them in this bench. Our GN logo render is next. For this, the 10600K completes the render in about 24 minutes, or 21.5 when overclocked to 5 GHz. That's a reduction of about 10% against the stock time, and the AMD R5 3600 stock CPU completes the render in 23 minutes. So it needs 4% less time than the 10600K. Intel is definitely getting closer here than it has been in the past, or at least recently, but AMD's pricing advantage does give it a bonus in this application. The Intel overclock matches AMD's overclocked position, and this is clearly hugely improved over the 9600K, which we were never able to recommend to begin with. And so the 10600K at least looks better than that one. AMD's, however, is still cheaper, and for the first time in decades, it's on a more mature platform right now. Z490 might just be a reskin Z390. But initial BIOS issues have been rough, at least for launch. The 3700X, meanwhile, is further advantaged and is roughly about the same price as what the 10600K will likely be, but we won't know until the parts actually go up for sale. Adobe Premiere is next, using real videos that we uploaded to this channel in the past. For this one, we're starting with a 1080p ENG shoot that would be comparable to other RNG-style A-roll heavy reports, and the 10600K stock CPU completed this render in 5 minutes. It's roughly identical to an 8700K or an AMD R7 2700 stock CPU. It's also about the same as a 5.1 GHz 9600K, so that's a generational improvement for Intel, if you can call that a generational step. The AMD R7 3700X finishes the render in 24% less time required at 3.8 minutes, and the R5 3600 stock CPU finishes in about the same time at 4.9 minutes. Although Intel has improved, the R5 3600 being directly tied makes it harder to fight against, given the pricing advantage of the 3600. Our 4K render is next, mostly comprised of B-roll at a higher quality. This one is more stressful for the CPUs. The Intel i5-10600K stock CPU shows that, as it now completes the render in 15.1 minutes. That marks it as, again, between the 8700K stock and 9600K 5.1 GHz OC results. For reference to what used to be an $85 part, the 10600K needs 6% less time than an overclocked 1600 AF to finish the render. The 10600K OC has it improved by 10% over stock, roughly tying the 3600 OC here and the 2700 OC in the 13.6 to 12.7 minute range. The 9700K at 5.1 GHz outdoes the 10600K here, showing that the extra frequency and 2 physical cores for reduced resource contention proves more valuable in this benchmark. The stock 3700X, meanwhile, requires 26% less time than the stock 10600K, although the overclocked result is a bit closer. But given that at time of filming these reviews, we never really know quite what the price of the product will be that we're reviewing, it's hard to say whether the 3700X is an appropriate price comparison for the 10600K. So you'll just have to judge after this goes live whether they ended up close enough to compare. Adobe Photoshop is next, with this one often favoring higher frequency parts over higher core counts. The 10600K stock CPU scores 960 points, marking it as about equal to a Ryzen 3 3300X. The 10600K does exceptionally poorly in the Photoshop test compared to AMD's parts, even after subsequent retests when we suspected the numbers. This exhibits similar performance characteristics to the 10900K because that also had some peculiar results. The fact that the 3300X is in a better position makes the 10600K a bad buy for a purely Photoshop-driven workload. 7-zip compression and decompression benchmarks are next, measured in millions of instructions per second. For compression, the 10600K stock CPU scores 54,000 MIPS, putting it between the 9700K stock CPU and 2700 stock CPU. The 3600 stock results scores 56K points, or about 4.4% better. This is consistent with previous rankings and shows that the R5 CPU doesn't have a noteworthy lead in pure performance, despite a price advantage. The 10600K at 5 GHz outdoes the 3600 at 4.3 GHz, but not by enough to matter. These two results are functionally equivalent and close to error. As for the AMD 3700X, that's just behind the 10900X, which is just behind the 10900K stock CPU, and those are the two parts that you shouldn't confuse with one another. For decompression, the Intel i5-10600K stock CPU scores 62,000 MIPS, now between the 1600 AF stock CPU and 9700K stock CPU. The 10600K at 5 GHz is right behind the 9700K at 5.1, illustrating that, again, although the frequency helps, true cores can make up the difference for a gap against a deficit in hyperthreading total thread availability. The 3600 stock, meanwhile, is 7% ahead of the overclocked 10600K result, or 19% ahead of the stock 10600K. Our Chromium compile is next, looking at the compile time in minutes with ClaneCL and Ninja on Windows. Lower is better, like in render tests. The Intel i5-10600K stock CPU completes compiling in 132 minutes, which puts it again between the 8700K and 9700K. It's consistent in that regard. We'll give Intel credit for its improvement over the 2017 7700K flagship, even at 5.1 GHz, and its improvement over the 9600K at, theoretically, a drop in price. As for AMD, the 3600 requires 118 minutes, so it's about 4 minutes faster than the overclocked 10600K, requiring 3.6% less time. Stock to stock, the 3600 is in the lead by 10.5%. Intel doesn't have direct benefit from adding more threads in this one, as the 9700K stock result illustrates against the 10600K OC result that the frequency accounts for more of its positioning. Our Handbrake Transcode to H.265 is up now. This one has some optimization level issues at the extreme high end, mostly with Threadripper CPUs that aren't shown here, but it runs fine for the parts we're discussing today. The 10600K stock result requires 17.6 minutes to complete the transcode, which has it equivalent to the 4.3 GHz all-core R5 3600. We're just ahead of the 8700K from previously. Intel is actually outpacing AMD's R5 3600 in this test when both are stock, with an advantage of 3.3% time reduction. The 3700X, meanwhile, runs at about 15.4 minutes, and so is advantaged by 12.5%. V-Ray results scale almost perfectly with the thread count from top to bottom, with only a couple of hiccups. The 10600K falls between fellow 6-core 12-thread parts at 10,474 K samples. The stock R5 3600 is above at 10,798 K samples, and the overclocked 4.2 GHz R5 1600AF isn't too far below at 9,905 K samples. The higher-end 3700X that falls closer to the 10600K in pricing is much higher, more than 35% ahead of the i5 in score. Intel's own 8-core 8-thread 9700K outstrips the 10600K in performance in this test, but the combination of 8 true cores and a slightly higher boost allow it to overcome the 10600K's 12-thread advantage. Since we were forced to reduce our 10600K's OC to 5 GHz to complete the production tests, the gap only widens when comparing to the 9700K at 5.1. That result is 11,859K samples versus 11,375K samples, respectively. Power testing is next, measured at the EPS 12-volt cables rather than the wall. This allows us more accuracy than wall measurements, but doesn't account for VRM efficiency losses. We'll start with an all-core workload from Blender after 5 minutes, which allows turbo time expiry via tau to kick in. For this one, the Intel i5-10600K stock CPU requires about 104 watts, putting it higher than Intel's 9900K stock CPU at 8 cores and 16 threads. AMD's R5-3600, for reference, measures 80 watts stock and 90 watts at an abusive voltage for our stable 4.3 GHz overclock at the time of review. The 10600K OC puts it at 218 watts at 5.1 GHz and 1.368 volts get. This is outdone handily by the 10900K at 317 watts for its own overclock. Cinebench R20 is next. We use this one to get the pre-expiry tau numbers for Intel Turbo. The 10600K stock CPU is in roughly the same position as before, but the 10900K shows what to expect for CPUs that run Turbo 3.0 and TVB. It's now at 200 watts for the stock result, a massive jump where it'll hold for about 56 seconds prior to dropping back down to its 120 to 125 watt range. The 10600K clearly is much lower than that, but the 10900K is the one that operates more aggressively in its boosting behavior. The rest of these numbers are all about the same as in the previous chart, including AMD's numbers, because they don't behave the same way with boosting and power targets. This CPU, we think, in some ways is almost more interesting than the 10900K, wrapping all of this up. The 10900K is almost boring in that it's again at the top of the charts when it's not limited by the GPU. It's a 9900K replacement. It's better, yes, but it doesn't really move the bar a whole lot because in production, for the 10900, we're still looking at kind of a 3900X as the better choice. It's cheaper now. It's almost sort of oddly on a more mature platform, depending on which board you have. And it's just better in a lot of those production application tests. We didn't really have any where it made sense to go with the 10900K instead. So, or at least not many of them. So that leaves gaming, where it's still the best when you can create a difference, but you start getting to philosophical debate of at what point are you creating a difference just to show scaling, which is obviously the whole point of a review and a benchmark where you eliminate variables, i.e. the GPU, but there is a reasonable point to be made about, well, once you're at 300 FPS in a racing game, how realistic is that? How much does that scale? And you might be able to say, well, this is to look out for the future of gaming, but that argument doesn't always hold up. So really what happens is when we're dropping the medium 1080p and a 9900K still looks very similar to a 9900K and 10900K look the same, then at that point it's kind of a boring CPU. So what they need is an NVIDIA 3000 series launch. And in the games where we do see scaling, like with high settings in F1 2019, for example, the 10900K has a pretty reasonable lead. And in Hitman 2, it has a pretty good lead as well. So it's still the best. Intel still holds that title for gaming. But it's like $500+, depending on how 1K unit pricing plays out. And that's a lot to spend on a CPU that's targeted at gaming. So fortunately, the 10600K can take its place, and an i5 is finally, again, enough for gaming. If you are only gaming and basically doing nothing else, the 10600K looks like a pretty good CPU. If you're trying to get something a bit cheaper, that's not quite as good in an objective sense, but is nearly as good in a practical sense, and has some expanded capabilities, but not much elsewhere, like about 4 to 6% improved in production, then the R5-3600 makes the most sense. AMD is still in an advantaged position. The 3700X makes more sense for production at a similar price. The 3600 is extremely competitive everywhere, including gaming, even though it's not quite on the top in gaming. The 10600K, however, is not something that we would call objectively bad, and we'd certainly say that it's actually worthy of consideration from a value perspective, but the 3600 wins the outright best value award still. So that's what you have to consider for this one, and the 10900K would be the next one for you to look at if you want to check out more reviews. But overall, we'll see where the prices fall at the end of this and do some additional follow-up coverage. Let us know what you're interested in seeing. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you would like to back order one of our new mouse mats. These had insane reception. We sold out of all of them in 48 hours, and I thought we had 6 months of inventory. So I miscalculated. But you can back order one on store.gamersnexus.net if you want to support this type of work. We'll see you all next time.